I never thought a simple meeting would change my life, or at least make me the most hated person in my neighborhood, but that's exactly how it started. It was a sunny Tuesday evening when I walked into the HOA board meeting. I'd been living in this so-called perfect subdivision for about 6 months, and I was already tired of being micromanaged. Everything had a rule: lawn height, mailbox color, even the angle of your garden gnome's hat. Honestly, I was starting to feel like I was living in a reality TV show designed by someone with too much time and too little sense. The boardroom smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, like a library that had forgotten sunlight. The president, a woman I would later come to know as Karen, sat at the head of the table, her posture rigid, eyes scanning the room like she was a general inspecting her troops. Around her, 3 other board members nodded at every word she spoke, as if she were reciting the Gettysburg Address. As I took my seat, I noticed the tension in the air. Everyone had their little pens poised over notepads, ready to record anything non-compliant. And me? I had my own notepad filled with my own rules, or rather, my lack of them. Karen began the meeting in her usual sharp tone. She read off the agenda with exaggerated precision, emphasizing every minor violation she had observed over the last month. "Mrs.," she said, pointing at a neighbor with perfectly trimmed hydrangeas, "your fence is 0.5 inches above the allowed height." I stifled a laugh. 0.5 inches. That's like criticizing someone for wearing mismatched socks. Then it was my turn. I hadn't even broken a rule, but I had something I needed to say. Something bold. Something that I knew would ruffle feathers. "I don't follow HOA rules," I said calmly. The room went completely silent. You could hear a pin drop, or maybe that was just Karen's jaw hitting the floor. The board members froze, pens midair, eyes wide. I could practically see their brains short-circuiting. Some leaned forward as if I had just announced that I had secretly been living on Mars. Others shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, probably trying to calculate how to deal with this unprecedented level of defiance. Karen blinked, then she blinked again, then she muttered something under her breath and reached for her phone. My stomach sank. That phone call was going to be the spark that lit the fuse. The tension was almost cinematic. I could see the mental gears turning behind her perfectly mascaraed eyes. How dare she say that in front of the board in my neighborhood? She probably thought. Meanwhile, I sat back, trying not to grin too obviously. There's a strange kind of satisfaction in watching someone who thrives on control lose it in real time. That's when the first signs of panic appeared. Karen whispered into the phone, her tone clipped, urgent. I caught snippets. Ignoring rules might need immediate response. My heart started racing, not because I was afraid, but because I knew this was going to escalate in ways even I couldn't predict. The other board members exchanged worried glances. One of them even fumbled with his pen and knocked over his water cup. Water spilled across the pristine table like a tiny tidal wave of chaos. I almost laughed out loud, but I held it in. Timing is everything. And then it happened. A neighbor sitting across from me, Mrs., who usually wore a permanent frown like it was tattooed on her face, leaned over and whispered, "Did she just call the cops?" I froze, my mind raced. Surely not. Could it be that extreme? Would someone really call the police over a lawn gnome rebellion? I glanced at Karen. She was still talking quietly into her phone, her voice rising slightly. I didn't need to hear the words. I knew the jig was up. As the meeting continued, every sentence Karen said sounded like background noise. My focus was entirely on the building storm outside the boardroom walls. There was a sense of something about to explode, something ridiculous, absurd, yet terrifyingly real. And in that moment, I realized that this wasn't just an HOA meeting anymore. This was the beginning of a saga that would shake our quiet little neighborhood to its foundation. And I had a front row seat. Little did I know, by the time the sun set that evening, the police would be at my door. I never thought I'd see the day when my neighbors would actually call the police over me. And yet there I was, standing in my living room, hearing the unmistakable wail of sirens cutting through the calm evening. At first I thought it was a coincidence, maybe a car accident nearby or someone getting a flat tire. But then I saw them, 2 black and white police cars screeching to a halt in front of my house, tires squealing like it was some kind of action movie. I opened the blinds, slowly, heart thumping. My neighbors had come out of their houses like it was the premiere of a reality show. Phones were out, cameras rolling, whispers buzzing through the cul-de-sac. I waved awkwardly, hoping they didn't realize I had done absolutely nothing illegal yet. The officers approached, walking up my driveway with that serious, measured stride that screams, "We're trained for chaos, but nothing could have prepared us for this." One of them, a tall man with a crisp uniform and a look that could probably pierce steel, stopped at my front door and knocked firmly. "Good evening," he said, voice calm but firm. "We received a report regarding your property. Can we step inside?" I blinked, step inside. For what, my perfectly ordinary living room? I opened the door cautiously. Sure, is this about the HOA? He raised an eyebrow. We were called to investigate a complaint about rule violations on your property. Rule violations? My brain did a quick inventory. Lawn check, garden gnomes check, mailbox check. Everything was technically non-compliant, but none of it should have warranted a 911 call. Still, I stayed polite. All right, officers, what exactly did they report? One officer scribbled in his notebook while the other glanced around my living room, clearly judging me. It's hard to summarize, but the report mentioned disregard for HOA rules, specifically a statement you made during a meeting. Oh, that? I tried to keep my tone light, but the tension in the room made my throat dry. I said I don't follow HOA rules, that's all. No threats, no vandalism, no anything illegal. The taller officer leaned back slightly, as if considering whether to arrest me for rebellion. So it's verbal, you simply stated you don't follow HOA rules. Yes, I said, a nervous laugh escaping. That's it, just words. The shorter officer glanced at his partner. Well, normally this wouldn't be a criminal matter. He gave me a half smile as if trying to diffuse the tension, but complaints were made. At this point, my stomach was in knots, and humor began creeping in as it often does when reality gets absurd. I imagined Karen packing her living room, shaking her fist at the phone, muttering, "I can't believe she said that in front of everyone." I wanted to laugh out loud, but instead I tried to maintain composure while the officers politely listened to my explanation. The taller officer cleared his throat. "We need to take a few statements. Can you describe the meeting for us?" I did. I recounted every ridiculous detail. The endless rules, the rigid tone of Karen, the smug expressions of the board members, the moment I declared my independence from their tyranny. I tried to make it sound as reasonable as possible, but every word highlighted just how absurd the situation had become. As I spoke, the officers nodded politely, taking notes, but I could see the flicker of amusement behind their professional facades. It was as if they were thinking, seriously, this is what you call a 911 emergency. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any more surreal, the shorter officer leaned in. "Ma'am, do you have any documents or evidence showing this conflict? Emails, recordings, anything?" My heart skipped a beat. Of course, I didn't, not yet, but I knew I had to start collecting everything. Every email, every notice, every tiny absurdity the HOA had ever sent me would now be ammunition. Before I could answer, a sudden shout from across the street made us all turn. Mrs., the nosy neighbor who loved drama as much as she loved her roses, waved furiously, clearly narrating the entire scene to everyone else in the neighborhood. My other neighbors peeked from windows, cameras at the ready. It felt like the climax of a bizarre sitcom. The officers exchanged glances, their professional masks slipping just a little. One muttered, "Well, this isn't what I expected tonight." And that's when I realized the chaos wasn't over, not even close. Karen had escalated things far beyond what anyone could have imagined, and suddenly I was at the center of a full-blown HOA showdown. I forced a smile, trying to stay calm. "Welcome to my neighborhood," I said dryly. The officers chuckled politely, but the tension in my chest didn't budge. Something told me this was just the beginning. Because by the time the evening ended, this little neighborhood feud would start attracting attention far beyond our cul-de-sac, and I had no idea just how far it would go. The officers left that night with polite nods and vague promises to look into things, but the tension didn't leave me. Instead, it settled into a strange, electric anticipation, like the calm before a storm, and in my neighborhood, storms were often caused by lawn gnomes and mailbox colors. As I sat on my couch, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The entire situation was absurd. I mean, seriously, how do you get the police involved over a statement about rules you don't follow? And not just any rules, HOA rules. Rules that dictate how you hang your flag, trim your bushes, and apparently even the number of pebbles you can scatter in your garden. The more I thought about it, the more ridiculous it seemed. For months, the board had sent me passive-aggressive letters threatening fines for things like leaving a Halloween decoration up too long or planting a tree that cast unauthorized shade over a neighbor's yard. But this was next level. They had literally escalated to law enforcement over a verbal statement. I began cataloging the rules in my head like a survivor preparing for battle. There was the infamous lawn clause, which dictated grass height down to the fraction of an inch. There was the mailbox code, regulating not just color but the angle of the flag when up. And let's not forget the gnome ordinance, which dictated the placement, type, and posture of lawn ornaments. Yes, posture. If a gnome looked even slightly off angle, you were in violation. I laughed quietly to myself, because if someone had told me 6 months ago that I'd be under investigation for the angle of a gnome's hat, I would have walked out of the room laughing. Yet here I was, in the middle of a suburban battlefield. The next day I started hearing whispers from neighbors. Some were secretly rooting for me, while others looked at me like I'd just declared war on the neighborhood itself. I caught snippets of conversation through open windows. "Did you hear she told the board she doesn't follow the rules?" I thought she was joking, turns out she was. "They called the cops over that." I smiled wryly. In some strange way, it felt empowering. For once, I wasn't just another compliant resident quietly obeying absurd rules. I had drawn a line and people were paying attention. But the suspense wasn't just from my own nerves. The HOA board had clearly gone into full panic mode. By the next morning, there were urgent emails flying back and forth between the president and the other members. I didn't need to open them to know the content. I could imagine the subject lines. "Crisis, the rebellion, 911 incident report. Immediate action required, she must be stopped." And then came the small, subtle signs of escalation. The president sent me a formal notice, longer than the Declaration of Independence, detailing every violation she could think of. I scanned it, stifling laughter: incorrect mulch placement, unauthorized flower colors, uneven paving stones. This was becoming a catalog of ridiculousness. I decided to take a walk, partly to clear my head, partly to see how far the gossip had spread. As I strolled down the sidewalk, I noticed neighbors peeking out of windows, cameras discreetly aimed in my direction. Mrs. waved and mouthed something about the cops. I waved back, shrugging innocently, but inside I was calculating every move. Every interaction felt like a chess match, and I was slowly realizing the HOA had just underestimated me massively. By evening, the tension had escalated to the next level. I received a phone call from one of the officers who had come the night before. They wanted to follow up, a more detailed statement about the meeting and my interactions with the HOA. I knew this wasn't ordinary procedure. It felt deliberate, like the neighborhood drama was now being taken seriously at a level none of us had anticipated. I spent hours that night thinking, how did it come to this? I had never intended to become the central character in an HOA nightmare. I had only wanted to live my life and let my gnomes stand tall. And yet here I was, caught between absurd rules, a vindictive HOA board, and a real investigation. I also realized something crucial. I wasn't going to be passive. If the HOA wanted to escalate, I would escalate right back. Every email, every notice, every minor absurdity they had ever imposed on me would become part of my defense. I didn't know how far this would go, but I knew one thing: I wasn't backing down. And as I finally went to bed, my mind raced with questions that kept me awake. Would the board try to push things further? Would the police come back? And most importantly, how far would I need to go to prove that their so-called rules had limits, and that those limits ended with common sense? Little did I know, the next few days would take this neighborhood conflict from absurdity to full-blown chaos. And by the time social media got involved, everyone would be watching. Everyone. By the time morning came, I realized the HOA's overreach wasn't just a personal problem anymore. Somehow my simple declaration, "I don't follow HOA rules," had turned into a neighborhood spectacle. The streets were buzzing, the whispers had grown louder, and I could feel dozens of eyes on my house, whether I was home or not. I decided to post about the incident on a private neighborhood forum, intending just to share my side of the story. I wrote it honestly, without exaggeration, but with a dash of humor. After all, absurdity needed context. I explained the meeting, my statement, and the ridiculous rules I had been violating. I added a sarcastic remark about gnome posture regulations, hoping to get a laugh, not a viral sensation. Big mistake. Within minutes, the post had blown up. Comments flooded in from neighbors I didn't even know I had. Some were supportive. Finally, someone stood up to the HOA. Others were outraged. How dare she disrespect our community standards? And then the inevitable middle ground, people trying to make sense of it all, like philosophers analyzing a modern tragedy. I scrolled through the comments, barely able to keep up. One neighbor even included a poorly drawn diagram comparing the gnome rebellion to historical revolutions. I couldn't decide whether to laugh or cry. Somewhere along the line, my quiet little street had become the epicenter of suburban drama. But social media wasn't the only thing that made the tension spike. The HOA president herself had responded publicly. She posted a statement defending the board's actions, highlighting the importance of community standards and subtly warning me that my defiance could have consequences. It was measured but threatening, the kind of post that made you want to check your locks at night. I could feel my pulse quicken. This wasn't just about me anymore. This was becoming a spectacle. Everyone in the neighborhood was taking sides. My phone buzzed nonstop with private messages from neighbors offering advice, encouragement, or just sheer disbelief. Some even offered to testify on my behalf if things escalated. I walked outside to clear my head, only to realize just how many people were watching. From their windows, neighbors peered like spectators at a gladiator arena. I waved casually, but inside I was calculating every possible move. One wrong gesture, one careless word, and it could tip the delicate balance of public opinion. Then came the small, subtle signs of real escalation. Flyers appeared on front doors, not the usual HOA updates, but handwritten warnings about my disruptive influence on the community. Someone even posted a rumor that the board had considered issuing fines retroactively for emotional distress caused by my behavior. Absurd? Absolutely. But in this neighborhood, nothing seemed too ridiculous. I spent the rest of the day documenting everything: screenshots, photos, comments. Every interaction, every post, every whispered conversation became a piece of the puzzle. I realized this wasn't just about defending my rights, it was about building a record. If things got serious, and I had a feeling they would, I needed evidence that I wasn't the problem. By evening, the neighborhood atmosphere was thick with suspense. People whispered as they passed by, glancing at my house with a mixture of curiosity and judgment. I caught a group of teenagers filming my lawn like it was a reality show set. I wanted to yell at them, but honestly, I couldn't stop myself from smirking. The absurdity of it all was too delicious. And then the real surprise hit. I got a message from one of the officers who had come the previous night. They had been following the social media posts and comments quietly, officially, and wanted to know if I had any further documentation or statements. My heart skipped a beat. The police weren't ignoring this, they were taking it seriously. The suspense became almost unbearable. Every knock on the door, every car driving by made me jump. I couldn't tell if it was paranoia or reality. And then I realized something. The HOA had accidentally given me a megaphone. My story was spreading beyond my cul-de-sac, and suddenly the board had lost control. By the time I went to bed, my phone was still buzzing, my inbox overflowing, and my neighbors were still buzzing with gossip and speculation. Somewhere in the middle of the chaos, I felt a strange mixture of fear, exhilaration, and satisfaction. The stakes were higher now, and the tension was building to something I couldn't yet predict. Little did I know this was only the beginning. The investigation was officially, and the next few days would push the HOA board to their breaking point. By the time it ended, our quiet little street would never be the same, and neither would I. The next morning, the first official sign that the HOA drama was about to become serious arrived in the form of a thick envelope, stamped with the local authorities' seal. My hands trembled slightly as I tore it open. Inside was a formal request. They wanted a detailed statement about the board meeting, my interactions with the HOA, and any evidence of rule violations or overreach on their part. I sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the letter. A wave of disbelief swept over me. Just days ago, I had been quietly living my life, ignoring petty HOA rules for fun, and now I was part of an official investigation. The gravity of it was thrilling and terrifying at the same time. I began gathering everything I could find. Emails from the board, letters with fines, photographs of my yard, screenshots of messages from neighbors. Every little absurdity became evidence. The more I collected, the more I realized how meticulous I needed to be. The HOA had underestimated me, and now I had the upper hand, but only if I played this carefully. Meanwhile, the neighborhood tension escalated. I started noticing more friendly visits from neighbors. Some were just curious, but others clearly had a stake in the outcome. Whispers followed me everywhere. "Did you see what she posted? The police are taking it seriously." I heard the board is panicking. In panic they were. The HOA president sent urgent emails to every board member outlining emergency strategies, trying to cover every possible angle of their missteps. I got the sense that they were scrambling behind closed doors, desperately trying to regain control. I almost felt sorry for them, but then I remembered the months of nitpicking, the absurd fines, the relentless micromanaging. No sympathy left. By mid-afternoon, I received a phone call from one of the officers. She introduced herself professionally, but with a hint of amusement in her voice. "We've been reviewing the complaints and your side of the story," she said. "We'd like to schedule an interview. It's standard procedure, but it helps to have all details clearly documented." I agreed, and a small thrill ran through me. Finally, the authorities were taking this seriously. The HOA board, which had assumed they could bully me into compliance, had opened Pandora's box, and now their every action or inaction was being scrutinized. That evening, I walked through my yard, cataloging everything that might become relevant evidence. I measured hedge heights, photographed the angles of my gnomes, and even checked the positioning of my mailbox. It felt absurd and a little ridiculous, but I had to be thorough. The stakes were higher than I had ever imagined. By nightfall, the first rumors about the board's panic reached me. I heard that they were consulting lawyers, drafting emergency notices, and even considering asking neighbors to provide character statements against me. The lengths they were going to were almost comical, except I knew they could backfire spectacularly. Every overreaction would add to the investigation's weight. I sat at my desk, compiling everything into a neat, organized folder. Emails were printed, letters numbered, and photographs carefully labeled. This wasn't just preparation, it was armor. The more I prepared, the more confident I felt. I wasn't just defending myself, I was exposing the absurdity and overreach of an organization that had taken itself far too seriously. As I closed my laptop, I heard a faint knock on the door. My heart skipped a beat. It was late and I wasn't expecting anyone. I peeked through the peephole, just a neighbor peering out like a hawk, but it reminded me how closely everyone was watching. Every move I made, every word I said was now part of the story unfolding in real time. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't just about gnomes, mailboxes, or hedge heights anymore. This was about power, control, and standing up to a system that had assumed it could dictate every little aspect of my life. The HOA had tried to bully me, and they had triggered something far bigger than a simple verbal confrontation. By the time I went to bed that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the interview with the authorities. The tension was almost unbearable. What questions would they ask? What evidence would they want? And most importantly, how far was the HOA willing to go before their overreach finally caught up with them? One thing was clear, this was no longer a simple neighborhood feud. The investigation had begun, and the next chapter would decide whether the board's arrogance would be exposed or if they would somehow claw their way out of the mess they had created. Little did I know, the confrontation was only going to get more intense, and the next few days would push both me and the HOA board to the brink. Every move would count, and every decision could tip the balance in ways no one could anticipate. I knew it was coming. After the investigation officially began, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. The air felt thick with whispers and stares. And the HOA, they were like a cornered animal, desperate and dangerous. But I didn't realize just how far they were willing to go until I walked into the next HOA meeting. The room was quieter than usual, almost suspiciously so. Normally, the president's voice filled the space like an overenthusiastic drill sergeant, but this time there was a tightness in her posture, a nervous twitch in her smile. The other board members were fidgeting, shuffling papers, avoiding eye contact. I had the sense that they had realized they might have bitten off more than they could chew. I took my seat, my mind racing through every detail I had documented. Emails, letters, fines, screenshots, I had built an arsenal and it was ready. The meeting began formally with the president calling for order. She launched into her usual litany of community concerns, but there was an edge to her voice I hadn't heard before, fear, maybe, or frustration, or both. Then came the part I'd been anticipating. She turned to me directly, her voice sharp, controlled, but slightly strained. "Ms. Your name, your continued disregard for the rules has caused complications." I stayed calm. "Complications?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Do you mean that people are talking about gnomes, mailboxes, and lawn heights like it's a national crisis?" The room stiffened. I could see the blood drain from one of the board members' faces. Others shifted uncomfortably, pens tapping nervously on the table. Karen's jaw tightened. "This is serious. Your actions have consequences for the community." I leaned back in my chair, letting the silence hang for a moment. "My actions? You mean my one statement? The one that apparently triggered a full-blown investigation?" She opened her mouth to respond, then paused, realizing there might not be a comeback. The tension was almost unbearable, like a high-wire act where a single misstep could topple everything. I felt a strange thrill. I had never been in a situation where absurdity and authority collided so completely. The rest of the board started to fumble. One of them tried to speak, attempting a carefully measured comment about community harmony, but it sounded hollow and forced. Another nervously shuffled his papers, whispering something to Karen under his breath. The cracks were showing, and I couldn't help but notice them. I decided to push a little further. "I want to be clear," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I've never broken a law. I've followed the legal requirements of my property. But your rules, some are petty, some are absurd, and some have been enforced inconsistently. And now, thanks to your actions, this has escalated to an official investigation." The room went quiet. The weight of my words seemed to settle on everyone like a heavy blanket. Karen's face was red, and I noticed her hands clenching the table edges. This was the confrontation I had been preparing for, not out of malice, but to expose the truth calmly and clearly. Then something unexpected happened. One of the neighbors who had been quietly observing stood up. "I think she has a point," he said, and for the first time I saw some of the board's carefully maintained authority crumble. Others nodded, and a murmur of agreement began to ripple through the room. Karen snapped. "This is unacceptable," she shouted, her voice cracking slightly. The board members flinched, and I felt a small thrill of vindication. They had tried to control everything, micromanage every corner of the neighborhood, and now their panic was showing. I stayed calm, letting her frustration rise while I maintained my composure. Every overreaction, every loud word, every unnecessary accusation only strengthened my position. I had already documented everything. Every misstep they made would be part of the investigation record. By the time the meeting ended, Karen stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The other board members lingered uncomfortably, unsure how to proceed. The tension hung thick in the air, but I felt a quiet satisfaction. For the first time, I wasn't just defending myself, I was exposing the overreach of a system that had assumed it could intimidate me without consequence. As I walked home, I realized something important. The HOA's desperation was now their biggest weakness. Every aggressive move they made, every attempt to control the narrative only added weight to the investigation. And I had learned something crucial. Patience, documentation, and composure were more powerful than threats, fines, or shouted arguments. But the suspense wasn't over. I knew the next chapter would be decisive. The investigation was picking up speed, the board was panicking, and the neighborhood was watching. And somewhere beneath all the absurdity, a small but unstoppable shift had begun, one that would eventually turn the tables completely. Little did Karen know, her next move would backfire spectacularly, and the investigation wasn't just going to embarrass the board, it was going to change the balance of power in our neighborhood forever. After that fateful meeting, I could sense a shift in the air. The board members were no longer confident, no longer in control. Instead, they were frantic, scrambling, trying to figure out how to contain the situation that they themselves had escalated. And the more they panicked, the more I realized just how powerful the momentum had become, and that the tables were slowly turning in my favor. It all began with a phone call from one of the local authorities handling the investigation. Their tone was professional but carried an unmistakable hint of intrigue. "We've been reviewing the HOA's procedures and actions," the officer said, "and we'd like to request some additional documentation. There may be procedural violations on their part, and we need a full picture." I nearly dropped the phone. Procedural violations? This was beyond what I had imagined. Suddenly, the board's overreach wasn't just petty or absurd, it might be illegal. I realized that months of unnecessary letters, arbitrary fines, and aggressive policing of minor rules were now evidence against them. I had unknowingly stepped into a position of quiet power. Over the next few days, I meticulously gathered everything. Every email from the board, every notice of fines, even their internal correspondence that had somehow leaked through neighbors was added to my collection. Each document told a story of control, fear, and overzealous authority. I felt a strange combination of anxiety and exhilaration. One misstep could ruin everything, but if I did this right, the board's arrogance would unravel in a way that could not be ignored. Meanwhile, the neighborhood buzzed with anticipation. Word had spread about the investigation, and my social media posts became a living timeline of events. Comments ranged from admiration to disbelief, and I realized that the board's credibility was crumbling. Even neighbors who had initially sided with Karen began to whisper, maybe she went too far this time. Then came the first direct confrontation. Karen attempted a subtle power play by sending a formal letter demanding that I remove certain plants, fix my illegal lawn ornaments, and attend a mandatory mediation session. But I knew better than to react impulsively. Instead, I documented every demand, every threatening line. Each one was another piece of evidence in the investigation, another sign of the board's overreach. The tension escalated further when the authorities called the board in for questioning. I watched from a distance as they shuffled nervously into the municipal building, heads low, clutching their carefully prepared statements. I couldn't hear what was said, but the body language was telling, hands fidgeting, glances exchanged, and a general air of defeat. For the first time, I saw cracks in their perfect facade. By midweek, the board's desperation became almost comical. Internal emails now accidentally shared with neighbors or found online revealed frantic planning sessions. "We need to spin this quickly, document every interaction with her, do not underestimate her." Even their attempts at strategy were evidence of their own mismanagement. I couldn't help but smirk, their arrogance had become their undoing. And then the most surprising twist. One of the board members quietly reached out to me. They were clearly trying to hedge their bets, offering information about past violations in exchange for some leniency. This insider acknowledgement that things had gone too far was proof that the HOA hierarchy was unstable and crumbling. I felt a strange mix of vindication and responsibility. This wasn't about revenge, it was about truth. For months, the board had abused their power, micromanaged our lives, and escalated a simple disagreement into a neighborhood spectacle. Now, thanks to the investigation, those actions were being exposed, and I had become an unlikely catalyst for accountability. By the end of the week, it was clear the HOA's authority had been diminished. Their rules were still technically in place, but their power to enforce them without scrutiny had vanished. Every neighbor I spoke to now understood the stakes. The board had overreached, and the investigation had shone a light on every misstep. And through it all, I realized something important. Standing your ground doesn't mean confrontation has to be aggressive. Calm documentation, clear communication, and a willingness to follow the facts can shift the balance, even when you're up against a system that thinks it's untouchable. Little did Karen know, the investigation wasn't just exposing her mistakes, it was fundamentally changing the dynamics of our neighborhood. And by the time the final resolution came, the board wouldn't just be embarrassed, they would be held accountable in a way that no amount of authority could fix. The suspense hadn't ended, it was only building toward the final showdown. But for the first time, I knew I was on the winning side. The tables had turned and there was no going back. The day the investigation concluded, I woke up with a mixture of anticipation and disbelief. Months of absurd letters, fines, and whispered threats had led to this moment. I had meticulously documented every interaction, every overreach, and every ridiculous rule the HOA board had imposed. And now, finally, the authorities were ready to act. By mid-morning, I received the official notice. The HOA board was being reprimanded, their actions reviewed, and in some cases, fines they had tried to impose were being. My heart raced. This was it, the payoff for months of persistence, patience, and a lot of quietly suppressed laughter at their overreactions. I walked outside, cautiously optimistic, and noticed the neighborhood had gathered like spectators awaiting a verdict. People peeked from windows, children whispered from porches, and even Mrs. seemed hesitant to glare at me as she passed. I smiled to myself. The tension that had hung over our street for months was finally lifting. The HOA president, Karen, tried to maintain her composure, but it was clear she was rattled. The authorities had reviewed everything. The emails, the fines, the arbitrary enforcement of rules, and yes, my statement about not following HOA rules. They determined that several of the board's actions had been excessive and in some cases procedurally improper. The other board members looked pale, shifting in their chairs like students caught cheating on an exam. Their carefully constructed authority had been dismantled by documentation, reason, and a community that had finally realized the absurdity of the situation. The officer delivering the conclusion had a wry smile as she handed Karen the formal notice. "What does this mean?" Karen demanded, trying to sound firm but failing spectacularly. "It means," the officer said clearly, "that the board's actions will be officially reviewed, fines where appropriate, and future enforcement must follow proper procedures. Any attempt to circumvent this will result in further legal consequences." Karen's face turned red, her eyes darting from the officer to me, then back to the floor. The room was silent except for the quiet scribbling of notes. She had been exposed, not just publicly, but legally, and she knew it. I couldn't help but feel a mixture of relief and amusement. All those months of tiny, petty battles, the hedge heights, mailbox flags, Halloween decorations had led to this point. The power dynamic had shifted. For the first time, the board realized that their authority wasn't absolute. After the meeting, neighbors came by to congratulate me quietly. Some were still cautious, but many expressed relief that sanity had been restored. "We've all been waiting for this," one neighbor said, shaking my hand. Another whispered, "You actually did it, you made them accountable." I laughed quietly, feeling a sense of validation I hadn't expected when I first moved in. Even social media buzzed with stories about the HOA showdown. Posts praised the careful documentation, the calm persistence, and the humor I had maintained throughout the ordeal. It seemed our little suburban drama had become a symbol of standing up to unnecessary bureaucracy and doing so effectively. By the evening, the neighborhood had returned to something resembling normalcy. Mailboxes were still the right colors, lawns were the appropriate height, and gnomes stood proudly in their gardens, but with a newfound sense of freedom. The board could no longer enforce rules arbitrarily. They had learned, albeit painfully, that overreach has consequences. As for me, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea, watching the sunset. It was surreal to reflect on the journey. What had started as a simple declaration I don't follow HOA rules had spiraled into months of tension, suspense, and community drama. Yet through it all, I had maintained composure, documented everything, and refused to let absurdity dictate my life. And in that quiet moment, I allowed myself a small, mischievous smile. I glanced over at the garden gnomes, each perfectly angled, or perhaps slightly defiant in their own way. They had survived the storm of petty bureaucracy just like me. Of course, I knew the HOA would never completely disappear. There would always be minor rules, minor conflicts, and the occasional overreaction. But now there was balance. Accountability had been established, and the neighborhood had witnessed that authority has limits. Finally, as the street lights flickered on and the night settled in, I leaned back, feeling a sense of calm and quiet triumph. The saga was over, not with loud explosions or dramatic confrontations, but with patience, persistence, and a little humor. And for the first time since I had made that fateful statement at the board meeting, I felt truly free in my own home. The HOA had underestimated me, the rules had been challenged, and in the end, justice, quiet, patient, and inevitable, had prevailed. Every HOA has a story on HOA Headaches. You'll hear the ones they tried to bury. Subscribe today.